you ever read a book or watched a movie and you felt very engaged with the characters and you temporarily forgot that what was happening to them wasn't real? Of course, you know that it's a fictional story, but you feel an emotional connection to it, and it feels as if what's happening on the screen or on the page is real to you. On the other hand, have you ever read a book or watched a movie and you felt like maybe, oh, that's not realistic, or that would never really happen, or something like that? That's called suspension of disbelief, or a lack of suspension of disbelief in the latter case. All fictional stories require suspension of disbelief, but some more than others, just depending on the genre and how far-fetched the events are. So, we're going to be talking about some examples of stories that require a lot of suspension of disbelief, or not very much, and how you can tell the difference between them, and what effect suspension of disbelief has on making a story engaging and enjoyable. So over here I have 5 books that I pulled off of my bookshelves, and we're going to talk about the amount of suspension of disbelief that each of them requires. So right here we have The Hunger Games, which is a dystopian novel. It takes place in a hypothetical future, and in that hypothetical future, things are not good. It's not realistic, it doesn't take place in the present day or in the real world, but everything that happens in it is theoretically possible. Next, we have The Firebird by Susanna Kearsley. This is a historical fiction with some very subtle fantasy elements. It takes place in the real world, in the past and the present, but there are some aspects of it that would not be possible in the real world. Next, we have I Am Malala, which is nonfiction, so not only is this realistic, it actually happened. Next up is The Lord of the Rings, which is high fantasy. It takes place in a completely separate world where there are elves and wizards and hobbits and magic and all kinds of things like that. It is probably out of these the most separate from the real world, the most far-fetched in terms of realism. And then Sad Cypress by Agatha Christie, which is a Hercule Poirot mystery. It takes place in the real world in the past, but it was contemporary at the time, and it follows a mystery story in which a character is murdered and Poirot investigates who might have done it. So obviously there are a lot of differences between these 5 books in terms of how much or how little suspension of disbelief would be required. The obvious place to start would be the nonfiction book. No suspension of disbelief required. So I'm going to put that one all the way over here. And we're going to move these over so that I can make room. Alright, out of the ones that remain, which one do you think requires the least suspension of disbelief? Probably Sad Cypress, because unlike all 3 of the others, it takes place entirely in the real world and has no fantasy or science fiction elements. So I'm going to take Sad Cypress and I'm going to put it over here. Alright, looking at the 3 science fiction and fantasy books, I'm a little bit torn between these 2. Which one would require more or less suspension of disbelief? Because on the one hand, The Hunger Games has only events that are at least theoretically possible. Now, of course, there are a lot of things that happen in The Hunger Games that do not happen in the real world, and there are a lot of science fiction elements that are not possible in the present. The Firebird has some fantasy elements that are not possible regardless, but on the other hand, it takes place entirely within the real world in the past and present. So I think it's kind of a toss-up which one of these would require more or less suspension of disbelief, but I'm actually going to reverse them because I think that the real-world setting makes the Firebird slightly more believable than the Hunger Games, even despite some minor fantasy elements. And then on to the last one, The Lord of the Rings. If you guessed that that one would require the most suspension of disbelief, you would be right, because unlike any of the others, it doesn't take place in the real world at all. It has no connection to reality. Now, theoretically, Middle-earth is the long, distant, forgotten past of Earth, and I don't want to leave that out, but it's very disconnected from the real world in the way that something that is historical fiction or was written in a particular time period and was in the present at that time would not be. So, how can understanding this be helpful? Well, for one thing, it might be helpful in terms of your own personal reading choices, your genre preferences. How much of a tolerance for suspension of disbelief do you personally have? Personally, I can suspend disbelief on just about anything. If it's high fantasy, if it's space opera type science fiction, if it's dystopian or magical realism or urban fantasy or anything like that, I have no problem suspending disbelief as long as the story is well written. But on the other hand, if you have no tolerance for unrealistic elements in fiction, like science fiction or fantasy, you might be drawn more toward genres like mystery, romance, contemporary realistic, historical fiction, and so on. It's also helpful to understand when you encounter books where you're not able to suspend your disbelief. I said that I have a high tolerance for suspension of disbelief, but the story still has to be somewhat internally consistent. When I'm reading a science fiction or a fantasy book and I find a lot of contradictions, the magic system doesn't make sense, or one minute there was no faster than light travel, but the next there was with no good explanation, that sort of thing can be very jarring to me and can really break suspension of disbelief. On the other hand, if you're reading something realistic, different things might break your suspension of disbelief. It won't be the magic system or the science fiction elements or anything like that, but if it takes place in a real-world location and you know that they got that location very wrong, that might break suspension of disbelief. If it takes place in a historical time period and you know that it's historically inaccurate, that might break your suspension of disbelief. If it's a mystery, but the mystery is not well designed, the clues are not well established ahead of time, and the answer seems to come out of nowhere, that might break your suspension of disbelief. So for both books that require a lot of suspension of disbelief and ones that don't require very much at all, there are still things that can break it, and I would actually say that for the ones that require less suspension of disbelief, it is also easier to break the suspension of disbelief because they are closer to reality. I hope that this video helped you to understand suspension of disbelief. If you liked it and you'd like to see more like this, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I post new videos twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays, and I talk about reading, writing, classic books, literary concepts, college tips, study tips, and more.